they're going to tell you that as much clout as I supposedly have, or even if I do, I never, ever would have used it for that kind of crap. And it's just, it's absurd that people get on the internet and can use words like reliable sources and this and that, and everybody believes it. And I'm not gonna go into details, and I'm not gonna give anybody that kind of satisfaction of me having to explain myself.
A lot of people want to stay relevant that way, though.
Well, I think there's a lot of that, and then there's a lot of people on the internet that just think, well, I mean, I'm like, well, that has to be what he's doing, because if I had that kind of juice, that's what I would do.
And that's the problem. Y'all are the problem.
Yeah. But again, my inner circle of people and the guys that I shared that dressing room with, and, they know the truth. And as long as they know the truth, then
that saying, like, my silence can long outlast the lies.
Yeah. And anybody that doesn't believe any of that, they can all line up single file. I'll bend over and they can line up and kiss my ass, because that's just the way it is.
Welcome to The Debate. Today we're diving into a really complex situation, one that sort of highlights the intersection of celebrity power, corporate loyalty, and, well, personal relationships, specifically within professional wrestling. We're talking about the recent career moves involving Michelle McCool and her husband, Mark Calaway, who everyone knows as The Undertaker.
Right. And this whole thing has stirred up a lot of friction, a lot of debate among fans and insiders, too. It really centers on The Undertaker selling his, frankly, very successful independent podcast, 6 Feet Under, to WWE. And in that move, replacing his original co-host, Matt, with his wife, Michelle McCool. All while McCool kind of simultaneously landed these other new, pretty high-profile gigs within WWE.
Yeah, and the central question here, I think, goes beyond just, typical career moves. We're really asking something fundamental about integrity, about how power is used. Does this whole pattern, McCool's sudden rise, the Hall of Fame spot, the WWE LFG role, becoming the podcast co-host, especially when you pair it with The Undertaker explicitly denying he uses his influence, his clout, does all that confirm he's basically engaging in calculated nepotism and, perhaps more importantly, being intellectually dishonest with his audience, the people who followed him for decades? I'll be arguing that the evidence, when you look at it all together, it overwhelmingly points to a clear, calculated use of his influence, which flatly contradicts what he said publicly.
And I'm going to approach this a bit differently. Look, I won't deny the timing looks suspicious. And the fallout, particularly with Matt, was controversial, to say the least. But I think The Undertaker's actions, complex as they are, might be better explained by, well, huge corporate financial incentives, maybe a preference for personal convenience, and wanting absolute control now that he's stepped back from the ring. Not necessarily pure malicious nepotism designed to deliberately lie to everyone.
Okay, I appreciate you drawing that line between, say, corporate reality and personal malice, but the series of decisions here feels just too coordinated to ignore the intellectual dishonesty aspect. For me, the most critical piece isn't just what happened, but the Undertaker's specific denial. He actually said regarding his clout that he would never, ever would have used it for that kind of stuff.
That statement is critical, I agree. But the context around that denial matters quite a bit.
Well, the context is the actions themselves, isn't it? I mean, look at the timeline. The original podcast, 6 Feet Under, was apparently incredibly successful. Some estimates put it around $5 million a year, basically for, as the source said, sitting on your ass talking for one day a month. Then it suddenly sold to WWE. This cost the original co-host, Matt, not just his role, but according to Matt himself, their friendship. He described it feeling like a breakup or being fired. And then immediately, right after this multi-million-dollar deal, Michelle McCool is just installed as the new co-host, which by many accounts completely changed the show's dynamic from, interesting road stories to what listeners started calling an awkward, stunted married couple show.
And that drop in quality, I'd argue, actually kind of supports my point about personal convenience over some grand calculated scheme.
Wait, hold on, because concurrently with the podcast sale, McCool gets a WWE Hall of Fame induction. Now, she was a solid performer, no doubt, but many observers felt that induction was, let's say, wholly undeserved given her relatively short run during a bit of a down period for the women's division. And crucially, Taker himself basically admitted influencing the process, saying something like, "We made an executive decision to induct you, Triple H," which puts him right there in the decision-making circle. And on top of that, she replaces Mickie James, who is arguably much more established and qualified on the WWE LFG show. This whole cluster of high-level placements, all happening in just a few months, it makes The Undertaker's denial of using influence seem, well, at best disingenuous. At worst, it looks like an active attempt to mislead people about how things really work behind the curtain.
Okay, that is a compelling sequence of events laid out like that. But I still think the motivation behind it is the key. I see the move to WWE primarily as a strategic business decision. It was driven by, frankly, enormous corporate money. Selling a successful indie media project to WWE for millions and then negotiating what sounds like an all-in contract for himself. That's a financially brilliant move, especially for someone like Calaway. He's always been the ultimate company man, incredibly loyal to WWE. Securing his financial future post-wrestling with his longtime employer, that makes a lot of sense from a business perspective.
A brilliant financial move, maybe, but one made directly at the expense of a friend and partner.
Well, yes, the way Matt was treated seems pretty bad. I won't argue that. But the source material also suggested Taker was getting sick of doing the show just 5 months into its run. It implies he was maybe already looking for an out or at least a major change, and perhaps only kept it going out of loyalty to Matt at that point. So the corporate takeover, it offered a kind of perfect, if ruthless, solution to his personal fatigue and the hassle of running an independent show. And his denial of using Clout, we need to read that carefully too. He was responding directly to a fan attacking him personally, calling him names, saying his wife runs his life. So his response, "I'd never use Clout for that kind of stuff," could be seen as defending his marriage against that personal judgment, not necessarily a blanket denial of all professional influence within WWE. And as I said, the fact the show's quality arguably declined after Michelle joined, that suggests it wasn't about professional advancement, but maybe more of a domestic choice. Prioritizing a shared project, maybe a happy wife is a happy life kind of thing, over actually maximizing the show's success.
I find that really hard to square with his well-documented history of wielding power inside that company. Let's talk about the definition and the history of The Undertaker's clout. I mean, this isn't new. He has a long track record of using his immense influence. He was the undisputed locker room leader for years, the guy who was the conduit to Vince McMahon's office. He famously banned video games backstage. He directly influenced creative, like having his then-wife Sarah pin DDP on TV, which was something. And he reportedly had a hand in talent decisions, like the firing of Chronique.
Those are examples, sure, but mostly related to creative control or maintaining what he saw as the standards, the culture of the locker room. That's kind of the traditional role for a senior figure like him.
But the principle's the same. He admits influencing the Hall of Fame selection. That's using influence to secure a major institutional honor for his wife. If he can use his status to help decide who gets a ring, a process he and Shawn Michaels allegedly just decided on sometimes, then his recent denial that he would never use Clout for that kind of stuff, it just doesn't hold water. It really looks like deliberate misdirection, like rhetorical gaslighting, trying to manage his image while still pulling strings behind the scenes. The public statement just feels fundamentally dishonest when you put it next to his admitted influence over something like the Hall of Fame.
I still think there's a distinction. Those prior examples were mostly about maintaining company standards or the on-screen product's integrity as he saw it. Securing multiple simultaneous on-screen roles for a spouse feels different. And we also have to look at the bigger picture, the institutional context here. Taker's influence on the Hall of Fame, maybe it's just symptomatic of a broader WWE trend, right? It's kind of an internal validation system that rewards loyalty, rewards legacy figures. We've seen other inductions, people questioned Paul Heyman, Stephanie McMahon, where the criteria seemed flexible. So McCool's induction might be less about Taker's unique dishonesty and more a result of WWE's own culture of rewarding its biggest, most loyal stars, sometimes through recognizing their spouses. He benefits from that system, sure, but maybe it's not solely his personal, dishonest power play.
Okay, even if we concede the Hall of Fame might be partly institutional habit, we can't just brush aside the ethics of the podcast sale itself, because that directly led to the co-host swap. It was, by all accounts, a blatant betrayal of his friend Matt, who was key in creating the show in the first place. They apparently had a handshake deal. If money ever comes in between us, we're going to shut the whole thing down. Instead, Taker took the WWE millions, didn't tell his partner, and then immediately slotted Michelle into the co-host chair.
It was a betrayal. I absolutely grant you that. And it doesn't speak well of his loyalty to Matt when faced with that kind of corporate money and pressure.
But doesn't it prove that the corporate move, the big money, and the spousal preference swapping the co-host were completely linked, and that both were prioritized over a long-standing friendship and partnership? Matt literally said he felt screwed out of a friendship and screwed out of your job. The evidence suggests his trust was basically monetized, then replaced by family convenience. How can we possibly separate the lucrative sale from the nepotism when the family member replaced the friend almost instantly?
I do recognize the deep ethical lapse towards Matt there. It's undeniable. But I still think the primary motive for the sale itself was financial and logistical. That opportunity locked in an all-in contract for Mark Calaway, guaranteeing millions, and it solved the problem of him managing an independent production he'd apparently grown tired of. Now, his handling of Matt was, without doubt, poor. But Taker might have genuinely seen the sale as just an inevitable corporate transition, something he facilitated maybe, but didn't maliciously orchestrate solely to oust Matt. And here's a key operational point. Moving the show to WWE's massive YouTube channel actually caused it to get lost in the shuffle, leading to a noticeable drop in viewers. That failure kind of confirms the business side getting that big WWE deal was the real driver. The co-host swap then becomes a secondary decision, maybe for comfort, maybe for quality control as he saw it, now that he was operating under the WWE corporate umbrella. The business deal came first.
But that secondary decision, as you call it, perfectly illustrates the negative consequences of nepotism, doesn't it? McCool's WWE career, if we're being objective, it's often described as relatively short, happening during a transitional, maybe weaker period for the women's division. It was arguably less memorable than some of her contemporaries. So this recent push to label her a pioneer women's wrestler, it feels like an obvious attempt to, quote, canonize his wife in WWE law using his lingering influence.
That's quite a strong take on potential revisionist history there.
Well, the evidence seems to support it. Look at the fact McCool replaced Mickie James, who is experienced, well-regarded, arguably eminently more qualified on the WWE LFG show, which for listeners is a pretty visible panel program, and then she becomes the podcast co-host. Where many listeners have criticized her presence, her interjections, it shows Taker seemingly forcing her participation through his influence, right? And the result, across the board, appears to be a product that's demonstrably inferior in the eyes of many fans. Which proves that using influence for personal gain can ultimately damage the very thing fans value. Okay, I understand the frustration about the quality, but let's circle back to Taker's own stated personal reasons, because I think they undercut this charge of calculated deceit. The Undertaker himself said he does the podcast for fun, and that he doesn't actually need the money now, especially with the big WWE deal. And when he was specifically defending his wife against critics of the new podcast format, he was quite clear. He said, "This is the direction I wanted to take the show."
And what does that statement really tell us? Well, it implies the choice of co-host was fundamentally personal, maybe domestic, separate from any professional calculation about influence. It suggests Tucker might simply be choosing marital happiness, that happy wife is a happy life idea, by creating this shared project, even if it cost him viewers or critical praise. He's prioritizing his family life, perhaps, over maximizing the professional quality or reach of the content. And that personal priority, while maybe damaging professionally, is different from the cold, calculated, intellectually dishonest strategy you're suggesting. Maybe he's actually being honest about his current goal, doing something fun and convenient with his wife, not necessarily producing the best possible podcast.
But that choice to prioritize his domestic life in that specific way is only available to him because of the professional influence he claims he didn't use. Deploying his clout to secure multiple high-profile spots for his wife, spots that arguably damage the product, betray a friend, and doing all that while publicly stating he'd never use influence for that kind of stuff. I mean, the totality of the evidence, the sudden, lucrative podcast sale, the really harsh betrayal of Matt's trust, Taker's own admission about the Hall of Fame committee, and then the immediate placement of McCool in not one, but multiple visible WWE roles, it just creates such a clear narrative. Influence was used for immediate personal and family gain. Taker's public denial, it doesn't feel like a statement of fact about his actual power. It feels much more like a strategic PR move, an attempt to manage his image and quiet the backlash.
And I'll maintain that while, yes, the outcomes absolutely favor the McCool-Calaway family, the root cause seems more likely to be this powerful combination. A massive corporate buyout offer from WWE, meeting Taker's own desire to simplify his life and work with someone he trusts implicitly, his wife. The subsequent undeniable dip in the show's quality and viewership actually supports the idea that the core decisions were driven by personal preference and finances, not some cold, calculated, nepotistic strategy designed to fool everyone. It leaves room, I think, to see Taker's denial more as pushing back against what he felt was unfair personal criticism about his marriage, rather than an outright act of lie about his structural power within WWE.
And so, we're left weighing the timing, the scale, the financial outcomes of all these connected events against the very specific, very defensive public words of a true legend of the industry. The question for the audience really remains, what's the truth about how The Undertaker manages his power?
Indeed, the circumstances definitely offer two pretty compelling, yet conflicting ways to interpret his choices. It really leaves the listener to decide where that line falls between, say, a justifiable, if messy, business transition and a dishonest use of influence, all within the unique culture of corporate wrestling.